India is backing an international resolution to find out the core of the COVID crisis. Where did the virus emerge from? Now, this is being seen as an attempt to corner China and join hands with other countries across the world which have been questioning China over the pandemic and over its hiding of the fact that the virus was so contagious. With me today in Government Matters, I have Nayanima Basu to talk about this, to talk about India's stance and whether India is hardening its stance against China and what kind of a diplomatic tightrope walk this is going to be. Do send in your questions. Nayanima will be happy to answer them. So Nayanima, let's talk about the World Health Assembly that's happening. What has been India's stance then? What is this meet all about?
So this is a regular World Health Assembly meeting that goes on every year. It's, as you know, that the WHO is the decision-making body of the WHO. However, this time it has got into a certain kind of diplomatic tussle because of the public spat that's going on between US and China, and now the fact that there is a resolution, a draft resolution which has been adopted by the WHO, led by the European Union, with support from Australia in terms of a diplomatic push, which has got support of about more than 100 countries as of now,
right,
which is where India is also a party, supported it. So it has suggested various measures, out of which the key thing that comes out is about having a probe into the origin of the virus and how the spread happened, and whether there were countries involved, also WHO's role in spreading the information in a timely manner.
Right. So now I know this resolution does not really mention China, but India has been very quiet on this front all this while, even though the US has been aggressive. There have been other countries that have been aggressive as far as China is concerned, but India has been lying low. But what is the sudden change of stance? Is there a rethink on whether to corner China on the issue?
So the public posturing and the sort of official position that India has taken so far is it has never named China as such for the origin of the virus. Officially it has never stated the fact that yes, it blames China as what US has been doing, but we've seen how the government has been having this regular dialogue on this with the US and other countries like Australia and the others which are part of the Indo-Pacific,
right.
Japan, Korea, who all are saying, and they have also publicly stated that they blame China for this. So for India, yes, it is a change of stance, but again, it is very clear that the draft has not taken China's name. It is just about having an independent review.
So why is this change of stance happening? Also, it's interesting that there is this increased tension at the LAC between India and China. So is there a connection? Is there any sort of talk around that?
So that's what the perception is, that probably it is because of that China is doing all this. But, we've done a story also on that, and sources tell me that, these are two separate incidents. However, we all know how China is sort of being aggressive, even in South China Sea, and all countries are saying that, China is taking this advantage of the fact that the world is now mostly, focused on the fact that how it will fight the pandemic, how it will come out of the mess, and how it will address the economic fallout that will be coming out of all this. So yes, taking advantage of that, China is probably pushing the boundaries, but they are in dialogue with India, and there are separate mechanisms which are in place, which is why you see all these border scuffles. They have been happening pre-COVID also, they're happening even now, but then they are being adequately mitigated is what we get to hear from the government.
Right. Now, of course, the COVID pandemic and the handling of it has put China on the back foot, but for India, China has been a growing cause of concern as far as the neighborhood is also concerned. Of course, we know its equation with Pakistan, but even Nepal under the Oli dispensation, there is a great China influence. Sri Lanka. So is that, in a sense, is India also trying to corner China so that it has more breathing space, at least in the neighborhood?
Well, from India's point of view, it has never stated that it wants to corner China, but it is also true that whenever any kind of aggression that has taken place, right, like what we saw recently in the border areas, India has also, seen eye to eye kind of a thing. Yes, there are these tensions going on with the fact that, and we've recently even heard the Army chief stating that Nepal is probably doing this,
Right.
with support from some
Indicating
other
that
country.
it's China,
Indicating it is China.
Right.
So, yes, there are these border tensions are happening, but it is also true that this border disputes remain unsettled. And like it or not, this is coming up at a time when India is also fighting pandemic, like others also, like Nepal, like Sri Lanka and Pakistan. But yes, with Nepal, the things have gone a little out of control. I'm
Right.
sure there'll be foreign secretary level talks that India has said will happen once the pandemic stabilizes, and we'll see how that goes.
Right. Let's start taking a few viewer questions, Nayanima. Aditya Jendiyal has a question. Do you think it would make sense to stay away from taking a direct stance, I'm assuming against China, especially when there are geographical issues with Nepal and Pakistan? Isn't it sensible to follow non-alignment? So it sort of takes off from the question I asked you
Yes, I would
earlier.
rather say it's a very sensible question because of the fact that, at this point of time, this is a situation, an unprecedented challenge that you are facing. You have to defeat the virus first, and then you can look at,
Right.
possible strategic moves. So at this point of time, whatever decision India takes, it has to take very, very carefully. But at the same time, we are seeing some strategic shifts are happening with Indo-Pacific, and the alignment that's sort of building up. There was a meeting of the Quad Plus also, which included the Quad countries like India, Japan, Australia, US, of course, and Vietnam and others. So yes, there is this tacit kind of strategy that India has taken against China, but it really cannot do anything more than that at this point of time, because you need China for several reasons for your own domestic purposes. So I would not really say non-alignment. That's a different issue altogether.
But to play
do a fine diplomatic balance. Yes.
Right. There is a question from Kunal Mehta. What is the other option for the world except to take a stand against China? Don't you think that China has got the free pass for too long? I think there's a lot of, let's say, resentment against China at this point because of the pandemic.
Yes,
and
that's
by
natural,
China
and that resentment is happening across the globe because of the fact that this is a virus that's taking away lives. There's a lockdown. Families are sort of divided.
It's affecting everybody.
It's affecting every one of us. So, but then yes, because of this resentment, it does not mean that you have to immediately take some action against China in terms of military action or any kind of diplomatic,
Right.
action. But things can be settled in a very diplomatic manner.
Right.
At this point of time, because you need each other, like you need because and they are your neighbors. You don't choose your neighbors, right? So you have to have that fine balancing relationship with your neighbors.
Right. Harsh Vakharia wants to know, why is India afraid to take a stance when a small country like Australia is so bold and brave? Well, Australia has less at stake. But anyway, do carry on.
So it's not about size of a country taking on China that is a determining factor here. The factor is what kind of support you can shore up when you stand up against China. So we've seen India has taken a stance when the Doklam happened. At that point of time, there was this third country also, Bhutan was involved, but it's not always Doklam if we try to see it like that. It is not easy to take a stand at this point of time, especially when the government is focusing on mitigating the economic challenges, on having a normal life resume back. And let's not forget that China is back to business. We are still sort of going there. We still have a lockdown going on. So to do anything out of the way at this point of time just because you're angry is not the way countries or governance operate.
Or diplomacy operates. There's a question from Sumanto Kakoti. What will be India's stance in South China Sea and Chinese maritime aggression in the Indian Ocean?
So India has always adhered itself with the UNCLOS, the UN laws on the seas, and now also in Indo-Pacific. It has never really stated anything publicly per se on South China Sea, but it has always maintained the fact that there should be freedom of navigation, there should be seamless trade that will happen, and at the same point, there should not be any kind of aggression impacting economies of other countries or the trading channel. So that's how it has always been.
Right. Samir Montani wants to know, why do China and India keep having fist fights?
Well, that's because it's very simple. We don't have the line of actual control defined. It happens, it's been happening for ages now, for decades, because both sides have a different perception of the LAC. And so long as I mean, there is no definition as of yet. There are border mechanisms.
Right.
Both sides have a special representatives. From our side, we have the National Security Advisor from India, Ajit Doval is the SR that you call, and the Chinese Foreign Minister is the SR for China, Mr. Wang Yi.
Right.
So these two individuals, they do meet, they have mechanisms in place, but border scuffles happen at levels where there is no definition. Sometimes the security forces go into fisticuffs, but then they all get mitigated at every time.
There's another question from Sumanto Kakoti. How do you analyze India's response to China, proactive or reactive? Is there any comprehensive policy of Western countries in response to the detailed, ambitious Belt and Road Initiative of China?
Well, I think it's amply clear by now that India has remained opposed to the Belt and Road Initiative. That has happened even after the fact that both leaders have had two informal summits, which is a new sort of setup between in the bilateral ties between both countries. We've seen how Prime Minister Modi and President Xi Jinping, they've met twice, first in Wuhan and then in Mamallapuram in Chennai. So these two informal summits have given a lot of leeway to both these leaders to discuss everything that's there on the table. And then every time the informal summit has happened, India has made it clear that it will not be part of the BRI, no matter what.
Right. Rohit Gandhi wants to know, India and China had a quid pro quo agreement on one India and one China policies. Will this trigger China to dilute the created relationship, and should the government of India be worried about Arunachal Pradesh?
Well, I think not really. At this point of time, nothing of that is happening at all. Rather, there is this tension going on, and we've seen how US and China has got into a public spat again on the issue of Taiwan, and the fact that how US has asked India to take a position on that indirectly. But as far as Arunachal Pradesh is concerned, those tensions remain again because the border is not defined. So one China policy, India has never changed that stance even after the 1962 war. So
it's unlikely to change now.
It's unlikely to change now. We'll see what happens in a post-COVID world. That's for the governments to decide. When they decide, we'll discuss about it. From China's point of view, they have also never sort of said that we are not, I mean, officially again, that we do not see one India policy or something like that. But then we do see the scuffles happening, but then we also see that the scuffles get mitigated. So.
Right. Tarun wants to know, will countries ask for compensation from China for the pandemic?
Well, as of now, no. I mean, countries have talked about it. Nobody has come up with,
official
this is the
figures.
official figure that we want. We've seen how Australia has been talking about this independent probe, which will now start under the aegis of the WHO. But as far as economic compensation per se, I don't think. Well, there are some reports coming up from other countries who are part of the BRI that maybe they'll say that, if you want us to be part of the Belt and Road Initiative, we'll not pay back the loan that they have taken to, for that project. But that's not that's really not India's headache, really.
Right. Ritam Goswami wants to know, does the West now fully appreciate the nature of hostility that China brings to the table in terms of security and not just trade?
Well, the West is also dependent on China when it comes to trade. So let's not forget that aspect when it comes to manufacturing, when it comes to supply chains, and also when it comes to global value chains. So yes, there is a lot of resentment at this point of time. It's been always there, simmering, and sometimes gone out of proportion, which is why we've seen all these strategic initiatives coming up, like the Indo-Pacific and the Quad. But things really are in a situation at this point of time where people are trying to first find the origin of the virus, where it is. Let's have an independent review and then see what happens. So coming back to the question, the West has always realized, everyone has realized, but this is also not a world where you just take one position.
Right.
You have to do a fine balance
Balancing
between
act.
strategy, military, your security,
And trade.
and business, which is what let the world go round. So.
Right. There's a question from Vasuji Dubey. Do you think there will be any change of production line from China to India? I think we've talked about it in past government matters as well, but...
So I think this is again, as what other experts are also saying, and in the print we have also done several stories and interviews, that this is too early to talk about shifting of production lines. Right now, companies are in a massive crisis mode. They have to first see the base that they have,
right,
the supply chains that they have, at least those are still there or not, and whether you can come back to the normalcy.
Right.
After that, yes, there is this discussions going on, I'm sure, within boardrooms, whether you shift out your manufacturing base, your supply chains out of China. But then that's not something that we'll decide, India will decide immediately.
Right, and
that's
it's not easy to do that.
It's not easy to do that because you have employees, you have certain suppliers.
And
there's
you
a
need to
lot
have a
of
conducive environment which India needs to work harder to have for more investment from outside.
And yes, coming to that point, what India has to do, India has to take a lot of adequate measures to make it conducive for international businesses to come here, like single window mechanism, taxation, more easy investment laws. You have to do all that within the ecosystem of how things work, the global supply chains work, to be really competing against China.
Right.
So it's not that as if tomorrow the pandemic settles and by 2021
there'll be
everyone is
fresh companies from China to India. Tarun wants to know, do you think Indian diplomacy should reach out to the USA to get the world together to first ask China questions during the official probe? So I think this viewer means that should India lead the charge against China? And they're not talking about a fine balance.
Yes, so India is not leading the initiative to probe China first. Secondly, the international probe that WHO will now do, the draft resolution does not name China at all. So these are the two things we need to keep in mind. Coming to what Indian diplomatic community is doing, we are seeing how, External Affairs Minister Jaishankar has been talking to Secretary of State, US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. Regularly they are in touch. Foreign Secretary Mr. Harsh Sringla, he is having this weekly calls with US and with the Indo-Pacific countries. So yes, and that is the crux of all conversation is to firstly how to get out of the pandemic and what to in order to understand how should these countries make China accountable to see, or maybe not just China, any country, how you deal with future pandemics like that. So that is what they are doing. Let's see what the probe comes out with and then the next steps.
Right. PB, well, that's the viewer name, that's all I have, initials. Would India actually gain anything by supporting China at this point? Is there a possibility of the settlement of the boundary issue in return? So basically, can we tell China that, you don't do this or do that and we won't push for the probe against you?
Well, it is, there was a lot of, mechanism and dialogues that were supposed to take place in this year, which are not happening. Again, let's not forget, this is a year when both sides are celebrating their 70 years of diplomatic ties.
Right.
But then again, to understand, it is not easy to settle the border like that.
Right.
This is about territorial integrity. Yes. I mean, it is like you give me some, I'll give you some. This is about territories. This is not easy. This is again much more complex than shifting supply chains out.
Absolutely.
So, and this, we've seen this discussion is going on for years now. It's not that suddenly post-COVID people will sit and settle all those issues. But those talks are going on.
Right. I'll take two final questions, Nayanima, 2-3 final questions. Dheeraj Reddy, what are the chances of implementing restrictions on China and how much effect will this have on global trade and global order if countries succeed to do that?
Restrictions as in trade restrictions?
Trade restrictions or whatever, any kind of sanctions if it's found guilty of, I'm assuming that's what the question is.
It depends what the probe comes out with. I mean, we cannot really preempt that the probe will come out blaming this, China as this huge villain sort of a thing. We'll see what the probe comes up with. At this point of time, yes, if things happen like the way the viewer is saying, then yes, trade sanctions may be a solution. It remains to be seen. I mean, I really do not know how to answer that question, but again, sanctioning China is not same as sanctioning Iran.
Right.
So these are two
Very
different
different
issues,
things.
very
Right.
different things.
Right.
So,
Kunal Mehta, don't you think that any action against China will also depend a lot on the upcoming US elections, since Trump is driving it? Biden might not be as aggressive, hence everyone will back down. So I think, it's an interesting question, because how do the US elections impact this push against China, this push for the probe against China, and will a possible, if at all there is a change of leadership, impact that?
well, yes, the Trump administration has been extremely hard on China for reasons that they give. I'm not saying wrong, right, whatever. We are nobody to say that. But yes, we've seen how the Trump administration has hardened its stance against China. But pre-COVID, let's not forget, they had also, were closing in on their trade war. There was this phase one that had happened between US-China trade deal, and all that. All those things were happening. Yes, till the time the elections will take place in US in November, this rhetoric will definitely go on. And not just that, there is this independent now, this other group of the resolution on the independent review that will also happen. US has been threatening the WHO also. We've seen today how President Trump had tweeted a letter stating that, there'll be a permanent freeze on the funding of the US if the WHO does not improve in the next 30 days, so
Right.
to say. So yes, all those things will happen till the time elections will take place. And even if it's, if President Trump is not going to come back, as the question is, the pressure on China will definitely there be till the time there's this review coming up and we get an answer on the origin of the virus, hopefully.
Right. Nayanima, before we close, very quickly, I do want to ask you about the equation between Prime Minister Modi and Chinese President Xi Jinping. Have they spoken at all since, or have they spoken about the pandemic, about the fallout of the pandemic?
So there has not been any bilateral discussion as such, but both leaders have met virtually over when the G20 meeting
Right.
had happened, and yes, there's been at the diplomatic level talks are going on, which is why we saw so many testing kits, PPEs, and other things coming from China. And China's envoy here has been also tweeting about it. Our envoy there, Mr. Vikram Mistry, has been doing all this commercial sort of contracts going on. So yes, it's not, India has not stopped talking to China, and yes, we are taking a lot of
But there hasn't been any
medical
conversation between Prime Minister Modi and President Xi?
No, in under the umbrella of G20 it has. Maybe they will speak soon, but not yet.
Right. Well, Nayanima, giving us a deep dive look into the India-China equation at this point, and why and how and whether India is hardening its stance against China as far as the probe, as far as the COVID probe is concerned. Thank you so much for sending in your questions, for watching our show. Do keep subscribing to our YouTube channel for much more.